Thanks everybody for joining us today. My name is Alicia Schilter and I have the pleasure of moderating this expert panel. We're just going to start with a few housekeeping items. If you have any questions during today's webinar, our panelists are ready to answer them at any time, as well as at the end of our session. So please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and we'll answer those as we get them. This webinar will also be available on demand within the next few days. We'd love for you to rewatch or share it with your colleagues. So now we're excited to dive into our topic. We're covering transforming clinical research, scaling real-world data across diseases with expert-led AI. And to kick off our presentation and discussion today, we're thrilled to have two experts to talk about how the combination of deep clinical data with AI is unlocking patient journeys like never before. First, Eric McCulley, Head of Portfolio Innovation, US Immunology at USB, is joining us, as well as Ryan Ahern, Chief Medical Officer at Truveta. So I'd love to pass it over to both of you to introduce yourselves. Ryan, let's start with you.
Great, thank you, Lish. Thank you all for attending. So by way of introduction, my name is Ryan Ahern. I'm the Chief Medical Officer at Truveta. I'm a physician by training, trained in medicine at Mass General, currently on faculty at the University of Washington here in Seattle. But I've really spent the majority of my career since training in the real world data space. And, as CMO of Truveta, I spent a lot of time thinking about our mission as it not only relates to advancing life science research, but ultimately about bringing those insights back to the point of care to positively impact patients. I'm just thrilled to be here with Eric, and who's also thinking about this exact topic from his vantage point at UCB.
Great, thanks, Ryan. And Eric, how about you?
Yeah, thanks, Lish, and thank you, Truveta, for partnering with UCB and allowing for us today to talk a little bit about our journey thus far. As head of innovation, I have two primary responsibilities within my remit. Most important, I lead the development of digital tools and solutions that help us better engage and inform healthcare professionals, health systems, and patients. And then informing that strategy and that direction is very much steeped in our digital business transformation strategies. And here, data analytics and insight generation is a core competency that has ultimately brought us together with Truveta. So very much looking forward to the discussion and any questions today. Thank you.
Thanks, Eric, and we're loving the partnership. In case you just joined us, our topic today is to talk about real-world data. And we're going to start off with some responses from you about a question that we posed early on. So what is the biggest challenge that you face using real-world data today? And thank you to everyone who participated. We received over 500 responses, so excited to dig into these results. It's a nice mix of answers here, but certainly a clear winner is fragmentation and lack of standardization of data. Certainly followed closely by lack of data availability for patients of interest. Eric, I'm curious from your perspective, what do you see here? What do you think about this?
Yeah, well, the first and winning response clearly is no surprise to me, and I'm sure not to anyone on this call. This is not just an industry challenge. This is a healthcare challenge in general. So I'll take just a second and talk a little bit about the second and third responses here in terms of data availability and incompleteness. While the disease that I'll be focusing on today is not technically classified as a rare disease, it certainly is rarer with respect to a lot of the more common cardiovascular, metabolic, oncologic diseases that we see, and we often purchase data and insights to try and get our heads around. But the incompleteness and the missingness of patient records is really important too. And for everyone on this call that sort of lives and breathes data, the idea of the connectedness of that data, those disparate sources to a singular identity, which really helps us to materialize a journey, is really, really difficult. And when you've already started with a limited subset of patients in terms of the availability, and then you need to stitch that together to an identity to really help inform strategy, that's always a challenge. And so I'm not surprised at all that these are two areas that have popped, and we'll spend some time on those later in the discussion today. But I think Ryan's probably got some comments on that first one.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. So everything you said totally resonates. And in terms of the highest volume answer around data fragmentation, I mean, at Truveta, we really feel like this is at the core of why we're not learning fast enough in healthcare. You know, these data are fragmented across thousands of providers. They're inaccessible on one hand due to privacy concerns. On the other hand, you know, so much of the richness is trapped inside of unstructured data like clinical notes, which are even harder to sort of structure and normalize and make sense of. And so not surprised to see this answer rise to the top. And it actually tees up a lot of what we're going to talk about in this session. So I'm excited to dive in. You know, so let's zoom out for a second. What is Truveta? Truveta was actually founded by a group of health systems in the US you see represented on this page with this unambiguous mission to save lives with their data. Really to use all the data inside their EHR systems to improve patient care, to accelerate R&D, to inform public policy. And to their credit, and kind of with COVID as this burning platform to take action, they really recognized and appreciated the value of the data inside of their systems, the impact it could have on the world. And taking action meant founding and funding their own company. You know, in Truveta, these health systems, they've pooled all of their data to achieve a scale that none of them could achieve alone. You know, they've also pooled capital to make a technical investment to structure and normalize and de-identify the data, an investment none of them could afford alone. You know, additionally, it's important for them to maintain governance as stewards of the data to ensure the highest possible sort of security and compliance standards are in place. And then finally, to these health systems, it's not only about unlocking the data, the de-identified data for research with life science innovators like UCB, but it's also about taking part in the research themselves and in the right scenarios, ensuring that insights are brought back to the bedside. So it was with that context that the company was initially founded and funded in September of 2020. So we're just about 3 years old. As initially just 4 health systems, we've now grown to 30 data contributing health systems across the US. You see the map here with their acute sites of care plotted. So over 700 hospitals collectively, 20,000 ambulatory clinics treating patients in all 50 states. And you know, this level of engagement from these leading US health systems on this topic of data has just never been seen before, and something we're incredibly excited about. So what have they all contributed to this mission? You know, they've all signed the same long-term agreements to Truveta to commit all of their data with a minimum of 5 years of history and daily updated thereafter, really creating the most complete data set ever assembled. You know, you see on the right-hand side of the page, you know, all their semi-structured EMR data, diagnoses, procedures, medications, lab values, vital signs, all their unstructured data, so clinical notes, pathology reports, operative reports, you know, the DICOM images themselves. And like I said, critically importantly is that they're contributing this data to Truveta to be updated on a daily basis. So the timeliness is just so key for clinical research scenarios that are evolving in real time. You know, think COVID, think about the launch of a new therapeutic or device, tracking that, tracking outcomes as the new therapeutic comes onto the market. You know, and additionally, ensuring that Truveta is fully representative of the US, it's really been a priority since the beginning of the company. And so now with 30 health systems, we're really proud that our health systems are treating patients in all 50 states. I mean, we have data from the largest metropolitan centers in the US, rural America, Alaska, and Hawaii. And that's just incredibly powerful from a research perspective, that representativeness. And then finally, you see represented in the lower right of the page, you know, we're linking a couple high value data types to the EMR data to enrich it and sort of further bolster completeness. So social drivers of health, you know, think access to transport, access to housing, income level, education level. I think we all can appreciate the significant impact that these factors have on health, often more so than some of the traditional factors we analyze. So having those data available and linked at the patient level, and thus enabling researchers that use Truveta to use them in control variables is just incredibly powerful. You know, claims data, We have a large portion of Medicare, Medicaid, commercial claims linked to Truveta, again, at the patient level. And this is all about kind of completing the patient journey, highlighting utilization events that happened outside of our member health system. So again, about stitching together that longitudinal journey for patients. You know, mortality data, so many deaths happen outside of the four walls of the hospital, and it's just critical for survival analysis. And then finally, pharmacy data, so that we can see not only when a medication was ordered by a provider, but whether or not the patient filled it at his or her pharmacy. Let me pause here. I think everyone in this audience can appreciate that simply having access to all these data is not enough, right? They're messy, they're hard to analyze, especially when aggregated across thousands of sites of care. You know, a health system CIO early in the history of Truveta shared this tweet with us. It's resonated with us ever since, and I'm sure it resonates with all of you. But let me use it as a way to sort of tee up briefly Truveta's approach to solve this problem of normalization across all these health systems. And then after that, you know, Eric's going to talk about how he's putting the data to work at UCB. So to make these massive streams of semi-structured data usable when you're dealing with data of this scale, and especially when it's updated on a daily basis, it's just essential to have an AI first approach. And that's exactly what we've done with the Truveta language model. You know, arguably the most differentiated thing about TLM, the Truveta language model, is that it's trained on nearly 100 million patient journeys. You can have the fanciest technology in the world, but without the right training data, the model will never succeed. So Truveta's data sets us apart here. And then secondly, of course, it's fundamental to have the right experts in the loop. And you see that represented on this diagram. So at Truveta, you know, we not only have world-class engineers working on this problem, but also world-class clinical informaticists and medical terminologists that are continually refining the models and improving accuracy. And with that, you know, our models for specific domains you see represented on this page, the models are surpassing human experts. And by the way, if you're interested in this topic, please check out our white paper on the Truveta language model on our website. But the main point for today is the result of this is that the end user or researcher using Truveta is presented with high quality, de-identified and aggregated data at the patient level from this multitude of different health systems, and it's research ready in the Truveta studio. And then finally, we take all that semi-structured data and then we enrich it with additional context from information from clinical notes. I think everyone on this call can appreciate the richness that's embedded in this type of free text documentation in EHR systems. And Truveta's approach for this is actually to extract specific clinical concepts from them and make them available as structured data, as you see here on this page. So for this, you know, the process really always starts with what the heck is actually documented in the real world. And we use PHI redacted notes like you see on the left-hand side of this page to answer that question. And the example here is, you know, it's a clinical note. This is a patient that did not start a specific anticoagulant medication despite an indication for it because of a concern for bleeding. And the Truveta language model can actually be trained with this manually curated training data from the clinical informaticist and the terminologist to extract these concepts. And then, like I said, make them available in a structured fashion in the data model, queryable alongside all the other clinical data in Truveta. And you see that represented on the right-hand side of this page.
That's great, right? Sorry.
Yeah, I was gonna say, one thing you'll see in Eric's presentation is some examples of notes from UCB where they're going through this process and kind of deeply understanding patient journeys and clinical documentation for specific patient population. Sorry
for the interruption, Ryan.
No problem.
We did get a first question from the audience, and I loved for you to address it. It's very similar to some of the early where the data is coming from. The questions asked is, who owns the data that's shared by the partners? What's the data privacy view of that, if you could speak to how Truveta approaches data privacy real quick while we tee up this next poll, that would be great.
Absolutely. So data privacy is paramount for all the health systems that founded Truveta and has been a focus since day one. We fully de-identify the data via expert determination, which is fully compliant with HIPAA. That the health systems are really the stewards of this data that are owned by the patients. And again, Truveta's process is to fully de-identify, compliant with HIPAA, and then it's only the de-identified data that is made available for research.
Great, thank you for that. Okay, so before we hop into a use case from UCB, we did want to pause for a quick poll here. We just heard a little bit about clinical notes that can be incredibly impactful for better understanding key patient insights. And we also know that as much as 80% of this healthcare data is said to be unstructured. And so you can see here, we've got a poll asking our audience to rank in use cases priority order, with 1 being the highest priority and 4 being the lowest priority to your organization. And if we look at how AI can uncover hidden details of these unstructured notes and apply findings to the high value cases, we'd love to get your feedback on what are the priority areas that are most important to you. So go ahead and take a minute here and rank these. We have clinical trial optimization, comparative effectiveness, longitudinal patient journey analysis, monitoring safety, adverse event detection. So again, high priority being a 1 and lowest priority being a 4. If you could give us your feedback, we'd love to get a sense from you of your priorities in this area. And then just housekeeping, if you did join late, please feel free to ask questions at any time. We'll try to address them like we just did with the data privacy conversation, and get to many as we can early on, and then we'll address some at the end.
Excited to see the answers.
We'll get the answers soon. Suspenseful. Okay. So I am seeing some early results here, and I believe we're going to try to share them in the screen. It looks like 59 people voted towards clinical trial optimization. Also looks like a high priority area is monitoring safety, adverse event detection.
Yeah, I would say, I mean, it sort of at the high, it looks like a pretty even distribution across of them. And this is not surprising. I mean, one of the things we'll talk about later in the conversation is we're working with life science partners on all of these fronts. I think one of the things that is very helpful for our partners on safety monitoring is the timeliness of our data. I think everyone would agree from a mission perspective, if adverse events are occurring out in the community, we want to learn about them as soon as possible and not months later, as happens when using other data sets. I mean, the same timeliness also is really important for clinical trial optimization. If you think about providing access to patients to potential breakthrough therapies, you want to be flagged that the patient meets your inclusion and exclusion criteria for your clinical trial on a very timely basis, and again, not find out weeks and months later. And then lastly, on comparative effectiveness, and then Eric, I'm sure you have some commentary around patient journey analysis, given your focus. The depth in Truveta's clinical data to measure real clinical outcomes that are often lacking from claims-based sources really enables comparative effectiveness analysis to compare different therapeutics to devices, devices to devices, etc. So, but Eric, curious for your thoughts.
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Ahern. I would obviously gravitate towards the longitudinal patient journey, and the rest of this discussion will focus very much in that aspect. But as we've socialized the value of these data in that particular use case, in working with our health evidence and outcomes research teams, there's a great deal of interest around that first one, which is clinical trial optimization. And to expand on that, considerations to understand how do we learn from the data, where subsequent indications for commercialized products might follow. And so anytime you have a data set that is as broad, deep, and as longitudinal, it does help you effectuate, to your earlier point, a faster pathway to get to some of those insights, to know if the signals in those data encourage us to move forward or give us strong reason to pivot or move in a different direction. But yeah, this is not surprising, the even distribution. It probably is reflective as well of the distribution of different functions on this particular call.
Yeah.
So sitting in the middle of innovation, I touch all of these functions in our organization. And so this is not at all surprising, but I think reaffirms the need for data to help us get here faster.
That's great. I know that you came too with a case study from UCB leveraging Truveta data. I wonder if we could go ahead and dive into that a little bit now.
Yeah, thank you, Lish. And let's talk a little bit about this particular use case. We're using these data to map patient journeys and generate real-world evidence across multiple patient value units here at UCB. But within immunology, which is where I spend the greatest amount of my time, we are very much focused on the disease of hidradenitis suppurativa. It's a mouthful, and so probably as we move forward, I will just truncate that to HS. And because it might not be really familiar with the audience, I'll take just a moment on this slide to orient the audience to this disease state. HS is a debilitating chronic inflammatory skin disease of the hair follicle. It presents almost always as extremely painful and inflamed lesions in the armpits, the genital area, groin, buttocks, and the breasts, the folds of the breast, resulting in these painful lesions, abscesses, which, if left untreated, that continuing underlying inflammation will lead to irreparable scarring and debilitation. And so just on the surface, nothing about that sounds good. It's truly a debilitating and insidious disease, and I'll touch on that here briefly. While it's not characterized as rare, or less than 200,000 patients affected, this disease was in fact founded in the early 1800s. And since that time, as with many of our diseases and pathologies, we continue to learn more and more about this disease. And the prevalence, as you can see on the right-hand side of the screen, it hovers around 0.1%. And so if many of you on this call have not heard of HS, it might be surprising to see that the prevalence isn't really that low. But what's particularly interesting about this disease is the fact that because of its insidious nature, presenting in its early stages, and the staging classification for HS is a Hurley disease state classification scale as either mild, moderate, or severe. In those mild stages, the differentiating diagnosis can be very, very broad. When you think about how it presents as nodules in these areas, it's often treated topically, and the underlying inflammation is often not considered. But as this disease progresses through its moderate, which is this middle picture that you see, or even to its more severe stages where irreparable tunneling and fissures have occurred, it can still be misdiagnosed. And as you see here, the average protraction from clinical onset to an HS diagnosis is around 7 years, and that varies depending upon the literature, but nonetheless, it presents a large gap. And inside of that gap is the need for an understanding as to why. Why is this the case? And we have some general ideas based on the literature, in that the primary patients who are affected are post-pubescent patients. So ages 18 to 30 is when you start to really see these clinical manifestations. It disproportionately affects women and people of color. And so it's primarily a commercial middle-aged population that could present at various points in the healthcare delivery system: primary care, obstetrics, ER, urgent care. And so as you think about the type of data that you would need to really stitch together that patient journey we referred to earlier, you need a data set that's going to be able to culminate these different points of care and patient presentation and interactions to a single area of resolution at the patient level, to really begin to map that journey. And that's always presented challenges in any disease state where it's insidious, its onset of action can be missed, and there can be multiple touch points through multiple, not just providers, but systems that have supported this patient journey along the way. The other thing we're going to talk about, and this is really where the value of these particular data come into play, is the holistic disease burden that this that hidradenitis suppurativa can bring into the picture here. And so in the bottom left-hand part of the screen, you'll see that hidradenitis suppurativa has a severe impact on the quality of life of these patients. And given the way I described the disease, I'm sure you can readily understand that the psychosocial implications of a disease that is this painful, and as it progresses, the nodules begin to secrete this thick mucopurulent discharge, which is very malodorous, that the stigmatization and the shame associated with not only the disease, the physical attributes, but where it presents on the body, all of this culminates into a really difficult clinical pathway for both the patient and the healthcare professionals to navigate. And so while we understand that some of the triggers associated with disease can be obesity and smoking, genetic and environmental factors, once this disease is diagnosed, we really want to understand, how do you more holistically care for and treat this patient? And what can the data tell us about the gaps in terms of accelerating diagnosis, as well as what that treatment pathway could look like? And that informs our engagement strategy across the board. Next slide, please. So let's take a look at what in the literature would suggest a pretty typical patient journey through the disease state. When you think about those early stages that I alluded to earlier, and those pictures that really supported that, on the very front end or the left-hand side of your screen, you see that cutaneous damage and HS activity can start with very little to present with, other than the nodule and maybe some generalized discomfort. And so it's difficult to catch on the front end. But as the disease starts to progress into that early stage 2, you see where this window of opportunity for early intervention might make the greatest difference. In addressing the underlying inflammation, we might be able to have a positive impact, not only on the disease progression, but on that patient's quality of life that I spoke to earlier. But once it gets past a certain point and the fissuring takes place and that irreparable scarring and pain has set in, it's really irreversible at that point. And so our mission, through the data and the understanding that we see in the clinical literature, is to understand how we can play a role in elevating awareness for both patients and healthcare professionals to get out in front of this really awful disease state. Next slide, please. So as we looked for partnerships to help us better understand the journey, the gaps, and the opportunities to educate, we came into contact with Truveta. And for all the reasons that have been shared so far, the breadth of the data, the depth of the data, the longitudinality of the data, as well as the comprehensiveness of the data, not just clinically, but the social data, the pharmacy data, the mortality data, can all of these sources together at the resolution of a patient really help to inform us in a way that we wouldn't have been able to really get to otherwise? And the answer was yes. And when you look at this screen in front of you, It's not too exciting, to be honest. But the point here is that in the repository of data that exists, within about 1 minute's time, we could perform a simple query in HS across all of those health systems that were represented earlier and see immediately that greater than 125,000 HS patients exist in this database. If you move to the right of your screen, we can also affirm some of our understanding in the literature that the majority of these patients are female, that there is a disproportionate representative of these patients or representation of these patients that are Black or African American, et cetera. And so we know we have a representative sample, a large representative sample that is going to have at least 5 years of longitudinal data with all of these other ancillary sources to really help inform us of the journey. And so this is a great first step to say, okay, I think we've got something novel here. Next slide, please. So one of the first things we wanted to understand is does the Truveta data show this protracted diagnosis? Because if it does, then we can drill into these patients and segments of these patients to help us understand the why. And the first thing you might be noticing is, well, wait a minute, I saw earlier that it's at least 7 years, and in these data, it suggests 2.2 years. And there's a really good explanation for that. When you think about the holistic journey, every data set that you work with has to have a starting point. And so at Truveta's inception, the contributing healthcare systems had a starting point. And in that starting point, there was a history of data that we would be blinded to. Even with that consideration and limitation in mind, within the data set that we had with the starting point and where we are today, and as that data is refreshed daily, we see that minimally, there's still a 2.2 year protracted space and time of where that patient is interacting with at various points in the healthcare system who have yet to be diagnosed with HS, but in the query present with all the traditional signs and symptoms that are correlated with HS. And so we felt like of the large representative sampling we had, we were still in a very good place to continue, that this data set would help answer and inform some of those questions. Next slide, please. So one of the first things we were able to do, and this is outside of the unstructured data, still very much in that structured data, we were able to begin to peel back in the subset of patients where there was a protracted diagnosis, in this case, at least 2.2 years, that there were very real considerations that manifested in this particular patient. And it's very consistent, again, with the overview that I presented earlier in terms of the psychosocial implications, but we'll also touch here on this slide on the surgical implications. When you look at the graph here on the right, it's divided into 3 sections. These actually represent quartiles of diagnosis timeframe. Short would be 25% of patients who were less than a year. Moderate is the space and time from a year to 2 years, and long, I think, is greater than over 2 years. Regardless, what's fascinating about the insights that we were able to uncover here is that with respect to depression and anxiety, those 2 conditions were disproportionately reflected and to a greater degree as the delayed diagnosis continued, meaning that we were compounding the comorbid impact of these psychosocial implications the longer this patient went untreated. Well, that's intuitive, right? That makes perfect sense. The longer a patient struggles and is in this kind of pain with the symptoms that this disease state presents and the life implications that come along with it, this is real. And what this helps us do is surface the patient's voice to the customers that we serve, the healthcare professionals, the health systems, payers, et cetera.
Eric, question for you. Is
Yes,
there
absolutely.
key differences between when patients are diagnosed in early stage versus late? Are there any key factors that you know of or see?
Factors in terms of
That
psychosocial
contribute to a
implications.
patient getting an early diagnosis versus a late stage diagnosis?
Well, I think that the answer to that is difficult, right? Because of the insidious nature of the disease, the difficulty in diagnosis, we are now learning what that might look like. We believe strongly that there's going to be a positive corollary between early intervention, reduced inflammation, and clinical outcomes, but that's the journey we're on. And these data are helping us inform not only the specific disease state progression, but these comorbid implications and these additional surgical implications and these work-life balance implications that go alongside that. So it's a great question, and our partnership with Truveta will continue to help us get there.
Thanks for that.
Thank you for the question. Lastly, on this slide, the surgery implication is significant, not only in terms of additional cost, but in terms of the increased disease state burden to the patient. Incision and drainage procedures are painful. While they do have reported effectiveness in the literature in terms of pain resolution, there is virtually nothing in the literature to substantiate that incision and drainage is curative by any means, nor does it suggest that it halts progression. So while it's a temporary fix and it can temporarily alleviate pain, what we're finding in the literature and is corroborated in the Truveta data is that one surgical procedure tends to beget another and another and another, which I'm sure you can understand and appreciate the implications of that long term. Next slide, please. So that's a lot to uncover in a disease state where it's very difficult to find the breadth of patient information to present that kind of information in the clinical data alone. What really gets interesting for us in our particular real world evidence use cases and patient journey mapping is what lives inside of the unstructured data. And so we partnered with Truveta to understand what would be the top 3 to 5 unstructured notes that we would want to extrapolate across through the natural language processing model, this particular patient cohort. What else can we learn about this particular patient journey? And so I have 3 subsequent slides that map this patient journey across about 18 months of time. And this is just one specific patient. Again, a key part of the value in having this narrow of resolution. But I think you'll find it interesting. And this patient type is reflected in hundreds of instances in this particular database. And so we know that what we see here is consistent, and it informs our strategy to better engage all members of the healthcare team and the patients to try and educate, enlighten, and make a clinical difference here. So the patient journey, we don't pick up on day 1, but we pick up on what has been a repeated number of primary care visits. The primary complaint of this patient is the abscess that we discussed earlier that continues to recur in the groin region. This primary care's diagnosis and in the unstructured, I shouldn't say diagnosis, their findings, their assessment in the unstructured data, as you can read, it's the 3rd occurrence. It's previously been drained by general surgery 2 different times. And due to multiple reoccurrences, there's quote unquote, some suspicion of hidradenitis suppurativa, some suspicion on multiple visits with the same problem that is unresolved with current treatment. It's a head scratcher. However, the primary care provider in this instance has decided this might be out of my purview, might be time to bring in a specialist. So I'm sure you're already starting to contrive. Yes, I see how this journey can get prolonged over time. What's interesting here is that this is a patient who clearly, if you think to the disease state, has drainage, meaning this patient is stage 2, has likely underlying and irreparable skin tunneling and fissures, and is in a tremendous amount of pain, and is probably missing a tremendous amount of work related to the implications of the disease. The surgical count is up to 2. The missed diagnosis or differential diagnosis is up to 3. And the total cost associated with this patient's journey to date is over $7,000. Quick note, I forgot to mention, This patient note and all patient notes are fully redacted to protect the integrity of the patient and for PHI. So wanted to say that. So dermatology referral, we're in January. Next slide, please. The dermatology referral is effectuated, it looks like a month later. So first of all, wow, very rare that you could get into a dermatologist in a month's time frame. But regardless, I think you'll find this very interesting. The chief complaint remains the same. This is a continuation of the referral from the primary care provider. However, you'll see that on examination, the dermatologist says that this is towards the middle of the bottom, that they do not think it is appropriate to start spironolactone or a biologic as the patient is not presenting with active disease today. So even with a suspicion of hidradenitis suppurativa from the primary care provider, the specialist still thinks that maybe because there isn't anything active, that it isn't necessarily treatable with what is known in the literature and indicated to be a modality of treatment for this particular patient. It's interesting, but it begins to answer some of these questions. As we discussed, this provider also talks about the risk factors of obesity and tobacco use correlated with this particular patient. But once again, there is no diagnosis of HS, and the follow-up treatment is an antibiotic, which this patient has continued to be prescribed over and over and over again. So fourth missed opportunity, third surgical count, and our costs now with the specialist involvement is up and over $11,000. If we move on to this last slide, I think the point is made. Through this patient's journey, which we know was at least greater than 2.5 years with active symptomatology, the patient presents again. And in this state, the patient is again complaining of the same abscess draining in the same area, which had reopened in the time between the last dermatologist visit and this dermatologist visit. And so the diagnosis is made, and the treatment might astonish you. The treatment is to wash daily with Hibiclens, to use a topical, and to maintain the antibiotic therapy, which on the last visit, the patient said they're not really disciplined at doing. So it's kind of a sad patient journey, but on the positive side, it's a patient journey which reaffirms what we knew in terms of the protracted nature of the disease, but it also enlightens and educates us as to the opportunity to partner in a multidisciplinary way across primary care specialists to help build HS awareness, to educate around appropriateness of treatment, because at the end of the day, that makes a meaningful difference for the patients that we all serve. And so we are very anxious to continue to dig into this journey and others to create further segmentation around skin of color, social determinant impacts, etc. But as a first pass, we were really pleased with what we learned, and we're excited to continue the journey. Final slide for me. So what were the key outcomes and the achieved next steps for UCB? Number one, as I alluded to earlier, the learning that we had through this patient journey and in extrapolating the unstructured data, we feel like we've enhanced our knowledge. We feel like we better understand the breakpoints and where we can intervene in a non-branded way to help educate and elevate healthcare professionals and health systems at the point of care. We do believe that by doing so, earlier intervention will lead to better outcomes. As to the question earlier, that is to be determined. But it's very reasonable to believe that will be the case. And as I also alluded to, this sets the table for expanded analysis with the depth and breadth of data that we have access to, and that growing source of data and the fact that it's refreshed daily. We're very anxious to learn even more and to implement those learnings in our HEOR business, and as we go out and educate the community. So that is it for me. Thank you.
Thanks, Eric. It was a great case study. Truveta is certainly very excited about partnering with UCB and other companies to look at these deep patient journey analysis. As you can imagine, there's so many questions in the chat, so I'd love to get to a few of them if we can. The first one that was asked here, and I think, Ryan, this might be for you. It's, can patients be selected from the Truveta population for specific clinical trials? For example, if there is a drug going into phase 2 for a health system, can a pharma company use this to recruit candidates?
Yeah, great question. Before I answer, I'll just say also, Eric, thank you so much. Such a great use case. There's no doubt that the system needs to better support these HS patients. And so we're just honored to be working with you on that. In terms of clinical trials, I sort of alluded to this earlier, is when the health systems founded Truveta, they did so with the intent of participating in the research, like I said. So they are actually incredibly eager to bring potential breakthrough therapies from clinical trials to their patients. And Truveta does have a way to enable health systems to more efficiently recruit patients, based on specific inclusion/exclusion criteria for phase 2 or 3 trials. So yes, we're excited about that use case.
Great. Eric, we have some more specific HS questions, if I could ask you about those. The first one was, how early can HS diagnosis be done?
Yeah, so that's part of the confounding. It's interesting. There's really not, other than what you see present clinically, a biological marker per se. You can certainly measure inflammation, but it's primarily at the prescribing or healthcare professionals' discretion, and that is why most often a definitive HS diagnosis is not made until that early stage 2, when those lesions start to break and the tunneling is evident, and all of the therapies or interventions aren't working. It's a challenge for sure.
And I would just say, having seen the disease clinically on only a handful of occasions, because of the stigma associated with it, these patients often exist sort of without any healthcare interaction, sort of suffering from this condition for years and years. Once it gets bad enough, they begin to present, in most cases, present for care. And then it becomes an issue of, are the providers that are seeing those patients educated enough to sort of rapidly get the patient to an accurate diagnosis?
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Ahern. And I will add to that also, the progress that's being made at large, the development of hidradenitis suppurativa Center of Excellence facilities across the various integrated delivery health systems is growing, and it's growing rapidly. So there's a great public reaction to this particular disease state, and so we're learning a lot, and I think we're on the precipice of making a really big difference for these patients who've been suffering for so long.
That's great. There's a similar question here about if there's work being done with pharmacies to include some of those pre-diagnosis, likely OTC treatments or other pharmacy type of engagements in that early disease stage diagnosis. Is there data there, other work being done?
It's a great question. It's one of those sort of augmentative data types that we have flowing into Truveta. And in fact, health systems via partners like SureScripts get amazing access to pharmacy fill data that flows back into the EMR for providers at the point of care. And yes, that is being made available at Truveta, because it's just, it's obviously critically important to know a therapy was prescribed. And then in terms of measuring adherence, critically important to know that whether or not the patient is filling the medication.
Well, and speaking to other data factors, Ryan, there's a question of, does the database contain SDOH factors and genomic data?
Yeah, also good question. So SDOH, absolutely. I mean, our social drivers of health data comes to us by our partnership with LexisNexis, and they have patient level, individual level attributes like access to housing, access to transport, income level, education level. Again, all linked to Truveta EMR data at the patient level. So, these factors are have such a profound impact on outcomes. And so our researchers that use Truveta use them often to control for confounding of some of these factors and really more accurately, conduct outcomes research.
Thanks. Back to some of your early conversation and slides where you're talking to notes. Could you address the question about how did you go about extracting the information from the clinician notes towards generating insight, and how long does that process take? Some of the early conversation that you were talking about with TLM.
Yeah, it's a great question. So there's sort of this foundational step with our partners where, again, we're answering the question, what the heck is actually documented in the real world? And that was a lot of what Eric just walked you through, is really understanding what's being documented for specific patient journeys in these PHI redacted free text notes. And then once specific sort of endpoints or outcomes or concepts are identified that we would want to extract and make available as structured data, essentially what we have is a process where our clinical informaticists create SOPs, which are actually incredibly rigorous to ensure that we're extracting the right concepts, accounting for complications like time and negation, et cetera. And then we have a team of medical annotators or terminologists that then implement those SOPs and create what's really a high fidelity, human curated extraction set. And then TLM, our engineers use TLM to train on that curated data set and continue to train it until it's surpassing human experts, and then deploy it at scale. And depending on the complexity of the concept, that process can take about 3 to 6 months.
Okay, great. Eric, we've got a great question here for you. In designing this specific case study, how much were you able to learn and understand about what you could get from the Truveta data set prior, planning the collection analysis, and actually seeing the data?
Yeah, so part of that question is answered with my background. I helped build predictive models using claims data and other contributory sources of data. And so I was very calculated in what I knew we needed, given the limitations of more traditional data sets. I was somewhat skeptical at the breadth of data and the ability to link that data to that patient level resolution. But I will say that in working with Truveta in the preliminary stages, it became evident that there was this capability. And I think we're just beginning to learn now what's possible through the unstructured data, as Ryan just alluded. We really want to get deeper into, can we structure the images that live within that unstructured data? Things like the Hurley staging that I referred to earlier. Is that utilization enough where we can begin to ask questions of the data to really help us not just pontificate on where is that Hurley staging relative to initial presentations and diagnosis, but at the point of diagnosis or at the point of treatment. That will help us to answer the question that was posed earlier, which is, what is the clinical advantage of early intervention, and with what modalities of intervention? As these types of data sets grow and get more longitudinal, and there are more capabilities, we should be able to get closer to the truth. So much of what we do, not just in HS, but across so many disease states that look like this, limited data sets, disparate data sets, we can extrapolate a lot, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's right. And so it's a journey for sure, but we've been impressed so far, and we're excited to continue the journey.
That's awesome. Well, we love your partnership. Ryan, there's one more question here, and I think you addressed it a little bit earlier on, but when you were speaking to what you derive from unstructured data, how do you really ensure the quality and accuracy of that data? And speaking a little bit to what Eric was just talking to.
Yeah, absolutely. So again, it all comes back to the sort of expert curated training data that is extracted by trained medical annotators working off of SOPs from clinical informaticists. What we're watching for is when is TLM surpassing accuracy, meeting and surpassing accuracy from human experts, and it's a high bar that we hold, but that's how we approach it.
Thank you both. This has just been a wonderful case study and webinar. I appreciate both of your incredible expertise and your time, and to our participants for all of your great questions. As one final reminder, there will be an on-demand viewing of this, and it will be sent out tomorrow, so you can rewatch the webinar or share it with your colleagues. And really appreciate both of you for joining me today. Thank you.
Thank you, Liz. Thank you, Eric. Thank you, everyone.